Agatha Christie, the kidnapped Prime Minister. Now that war and the problems of war are things of the past, I think I may safely venture to reveal to the world the part which my friend Poirot played in a moment of national crisis. The secret has been well guarded, not a whisper of it reached the press. But now that the need for secrecy has gone by, I feel it is only just that England should know the debt it owes to my quaint little friend, whose marvelous brains so ably averted a great catastrophe. One evening after dinner, I will not particularize the date, it suffices to say that it was at the time when peace by negotiation was the parrot cry of England's enemies, my friend and I were sitting in his rooms. After being invalided out of the army, I had been given a recruiting job, and it had become my custom to drop in on Poirot in the evenings after dinner and talk with him of any cases of interest that he might have on hand. I was attempting to discuss with him the sensational news of that day, no less than an attempted assassination of Mr. David McAdam, England's Prime Minister. The account in the papers had evidently been carefully censored. No details were given save that the Prime Minister had had a marvelous escape, the bullet just grazing his cheek. I considered that our police must have been shamefully careless for such an outrage to be possible. I could well understand that the German agents in England would be willing to risk much for such an achievement. Fighting Mac, as his own party had nicknamed him, had strenuously and unequivocally combated the pacifist influence which was becoming so prevalent. He was more than England's Prime Minister, he was England, and to have removed him from his sphere of influence would have been a crushing and paralyzing blow to Britain. Poirot was busy mopping a grey suit with a minute sponge. Never was there a dandy such as Hercule Poirot. Neatness and order were his passion. Now, with the odor of benzene filling the air, he was quite unable to give me his full attention. "In a little minute I am with you, my friend. I have all but finished the spot of grease. He is not good. I remove him," so he waved his sponge. I smiled as I lit another cigarette. "Anything interesting on?" I inquired after a minute or two. "I assist a, how do you call it? Charwoman to find her husband. A difficult affair needing tact, for I have a little idea that when he is found, he will not be pleased." "What would you?" For my part, I sympathize with him. He was a man of discrimination to lose himself. I laughed. At last, the spot of grease, he is gone. "I am at your disposal. I was asking you what you thought of this attempt to assassinate Madame Montfontage," I replied. "Poirot," replied Poirot promptly, "one can hardly take it seriously. To fire with the rifle never does it succeed. It is a device of the past. It was very near succeeding this time," I reminded him. Poirot shook his head impatiently. He was about to reply when the landlady thrust her head round the door and informed him that there were two gentlemen below who wanted to see him. "They won't give their names, sir, but they say as it's very important." "Let them mount," said Poirot, carefully folding his grey trousers. In a few minutes, the two visitors were ushered in, and my heart gave a leap as in the foremost I recognized no less a personage than Lord Estair, leader of the House of Commons, whilst his companion, Mr. Bernard Dodge, was also a member of the War Cabinet and, as I knew, a close personal friend of the Prime Minister. "Monsieur Poirot?" said Lord Estair interrogatively. My friend bowed. The great man looked at me and hesitated. "My business is private. You may speak freely." Before Captain Hastings said, "My friend," nodding to me to remain. He has not all the gifts. No, but I answer for his discretion. Lord Estire still hesitated, but Mr. Dodge broke in abruptly. Oh, come on, don't let's beat about the bush. As far as I can see, the whole of England will know the hole we're in soon enough. Time's everything. Pray be seated, murmured Poirot politely. Will you take the big chair, me lord? Lord Estire started slightly. You know me? Poirot smiled. Certainly. I read the little papers with the pictures. How should I not know you? Mr. Poirot, I have come to consult you upon a matter of the most vital urgency. I must ask for absolute secrecy. You have the word of Hercule Poirot. I can say no more, said my friend grandiloquently. It concerns the Prime Minister. We are in grave trouble. We're up a tree, interposed Mr. Dodge. The injury is serious, then? I asked. What injury? The bullet wound? Oh, that, cried Mr. Dodge contemptuously. That's old history. As my colleague says, continued Lord Estire, that affair is over and done with. Luckily, it failed. I wish I could say as much for the second attempt. There has been a second attempt, then? Yes, though not of the same nature. Mr. Poirot, the Prime Minister has disappeared. What? He has been kidnapped? Impossible! I cried, stupefied. Poirot threw a withering glance at me which I knew enjoined me to keep my mouth shut. Unfortunately, impossible as it seems, it is only too true, continued his lordship. Poirot looked at Mr. Dodge. You said just now, monsieur, that time was everything. What did you mean by that? The two men exchanged glances, and then Lord Estire said, You have heard, Mr. Poirot, of the approaching Allied conference? My friend nodded. For obvious reasons, no details have been given of when and where it is to take place. But although it has been kept out of the newspapers, the date is, of course, widely known in diplomatic circles. The conference is to be held tomorrow, Thursday evening, at Versailles. Now you perceive the terrible gravity of the situation. I will not conceal from you that the Prime Minister's presence at the conference is a vital necessity. The pacifist propaganda started and maintained by the German agents in our midst has been very active. It is the universal opinion that the turning point of the conference will be the strong personality of the Prime Minister. His absence may have the most serious results, possibly a premature and disastrous peace, and we have no one who can be sent in his place. He alone can represent England. Pooh's face had grown very grave. Then you regard the kidnapping of the Prime Minister as a direct attempt to prevent his being present at the conference? Most certainly I do. He was actually on his way to France at the time, and the conference is to be held at 9 o'clock tomorrow night. Poirot drew an enormous watch from his pocket. It is now 9:15. 24 hours, said Mr. Dodge thoughtfully. And a quarter, amended Poirot. Do not forget the quarter, Muir. It may come in useful. Now for the details. The abduction, Did it take place in England or in France? In France. Mr. McAdam crossed to France this morning. He was to stay tonight as the guest of the Commander-in-Chief, proceeding tomorrow to Paris. He was conveyed across the Channel by destroyer. At Boulogne, he was met by a car from General Headquarters and one of the Commander-in-Chief's ADCs. Ian? Well, they started from Boulogne. But they never arrived. What, Muir? Poirot, it was a bogus car and a bogus ADC. The real car was found in a side road with the chauffeur and the ADC neatly gagged and bound, and the bogus car is still at large. Poirot made a gesture of impatience. Incredible! Surely it cannot escape. Attention for long, so we thought it seemed merely a question of searching thoroughly. That part of France is under military law. We were convinced that the car could not go long unnoticed. The French police, our own Scotland Yard men, and the military are straining every nerve. It is, as you say, incredible, but nothing has been discovered. At that moment, a tap came at the door, and a young officer entered with a heavily sealed envelope, which he handed to Lord Astir. Just through from France, sir. I brought it on here as you directed. The minister tore it open eagerly and uttered an exclamation. The officer withdrew. Here is news at last. This telegram has just been decoded. They have found the second car. Also, the secretary, Daniels, chloroformed, gagged, and bound in an abandoned farm near sea. He remembers nothing except something being pressed against his mouth and nose from behind and struggling to free himself. The police are satisfied as to the genuineness of his statement, and they have found nothing else. No, not the Prime Minister's dead body. Then there is hope. But it is strange. Why, after trying to shoot him this morning, are they now taking so much trouble to keep him alive? Dodge shook his head. One thing's quite certain. They are determined at all costs to prevent his attending the conference. If it is humanly possible, the Prime Minister shall be there. God grant it is not too late. Now, Neeser, recount to me everything from the beginning. I must know about this shooting affair as well. Last night, the Prime Minister, accompanied by one of his secretaries, Captain Daniels. The same who accompanied him to France? Yes. As I was saying, they motored down to Windsor where the Prime Minister was granted an audience early this morning. He returned to town, and it was on the way that the attempted assassination took place. One moment, if you please. Who is this Captain Daniels? You have his dossier? Lord Astir smiled. I thought you would ask me that. We do not know very much of him. He is of no particular family. He has served in the English army and is an extremely able secretary, being an exceptionally fine linguist. I believe he speaks 7 languages. It is for that reason that the Prime Minister chose him to accompany him to France. Has he any relatives in England? 2. A Mrs. Everard, who lives at Hampstead, and a Miss Daniels, who lives near Ascot. Ascot, that is near to Windsor, is it not? That point has not been overlooked, but it has led to nothing. You regard Captain Daniels, then, as above suspicion? A shade of bitterness crept into Lord Estier's voice as he replied, no more, perhaps, in these days. I should hesitate before I pronounced anyone above suspicion. Trine, now I understand, my lord, that the Prime Minister would, as a matter of course, be under vigilant police protection, which ought to render any assault upon him an impossibility. Lord Estier bowed his head. That is so. The Prime Minister's car was closely followed by another car containing detectives in plain clothes. Mr. McAdam knew nothing of these precautions. He is personally a most fearless man and would be inclined to sweep them away arbitrarily, but naturally, the police make their own arrangements. In fact, the Premier's chauffeur, O'Murphy, is a seaman. O'Murphy, that is a name of Ireland, is it not so? Yes, he is an Irishman. From what part of Ireland? County Clare, I believe. Tens, but proceed, my lord. The Premier started for London. The car was a closed one. He and Captain Daniels sat inside. The second car followed as usual, but unluckily for some unknown reason the Prime Minister's car deviated from the main road at a point where the road curves. Interrupted Poirot, yes, but how did you know? O'Hid continued, for some unknown reason, Lord Estier, the Premier's car left the main road. The police car, unaware of the deviation, continued to keep to the high road. At a short distance down the unfrequented lane, the Prime Minister's car was suddenly held up by a band of masked men. The chauffeur, that brave O'Murphy, murmured Poirot thoughtfully. The chauffeur, momentarily taken aback, jammed on the brakes. The Prime Minister put his head out of the window. Instantly, a shot rang out, then another. The first one grazed his cheek. The second, fortunately, went wide. The chauffeur, now realizing the danger, instantly forged straight ahead, scattering the band of men. A near escape. I ejaculated with a shiver. Mr. McAdam refused to make any fuss over the slight wound he had received. He declared it was only a scratch. He stopped at a local cottage hospital where it was dressed and bound up. He did not, of course, reveal his identity. He then drove as per schedule straight to Charing Cross, where a special train for DOA was awaiting him. After a brief account of what had been given to the anxious police by Captain Daniels, he duly departed for France. At DOA, he went on board the waiting destroyer at Bologna. As you know, the bogus car was waiting for him, carrying the Union Jack and correct in every detail. That is all you have to tell me. Yes, there is no other circumstance that you have omitted, my lord. Well, there is one rather peculiar thing. Yes, the Prime Minister's car did not return home after leaving the Prime Minister at Charing Cross. The police were anxious to interview O'Murphy, so a search was instituted at once. The car was discovered standing outside a certain unsavory little restaurant in Soho, which is well known as a meeting place of German agents, and the chauffeur was nowhere to be found. He too had disappeared. So, said Poirot thoughtfully, there are two disappearances, the Prime Minister in France and O'Murphy in London. He looked keenly at Lord Est, who made a gesture of despair. I can only tell you, M. Poirot, that if anyone had suggested to me yesterday that O'Murphy was a traitor, I should have laughed in his face. And today I do not know what to think." Puo nodded gravely. He looked at his turnip of a watch again. "I understand that I have carte blanche, Muir, in every way. I mean, I must be able to go where I choose and how I choose." "Perfectly. There is a special train leaving for DOA in an hour's time with a further contingent from Scotland Yard. You shall be accompanied by a military officer and a seaman who will hold themselves at your disposal in every way. Is that satisfactory?" "Quite. One more question before you leave, miss. What made you come to me? I am unknown, obscure, in this great London of yours. We sought you out on the express recommendation and wish of a very great man of your own country." "Comment? My old friend, the prefect?" Lord Astir shook his head. "One higher than the prefect. One whose word was once law in Belgium and shall be again, that England has sworn." Puo's hand flew swiftly to a dramatic salute. "Amen to that. Ah, but my master does not forget, Mesher. I, Hercule Puo, will serve you faithfully. Heaven only sends that it will be in time. But this is dark, dark, I cannot see." "Well, Puo," I cried impatiently as the door closed behind the ministers, "what do you think?" My friend was busy packing a minute suitcase with quick, deft movements. He shook his head thoughtfully. "I do not know what to think. My brains desert me. Why, as you said, kidnap him when? A knock on the head would do as well," I mused. "Pardon me, mon ami, but I did not quite say that. It is undoubtedly far more their affair to kidnap him." "But why?" "Because uncertainty creates panic, that is one reason. Were the Prime Minister dead, it would be a terrible calamity, but the situation would have to be faced. But now you have paralysis. Will the Prime Minister reappear or will he not? Is he dead or alive? Nobody knows, and until they know, nothing definite can be done. And as I tell you, uncertainty breeds panic, which is what less bosses are playing for. For then again, if the kidnappers are holding him secretly somewhere, they have the advantage of being able to make terms with both sides. The German government is not a liberal paymaster as a rule, but no doubt they can be made to disgorge substantial remittances in such a case as this. Thirdly, they run no risk of the hangman's rope. Oh, decidedly, kidnapping is their affair. Then if that is so, why should they first try to shoot him?" Poirot made a gesture of anger. "Ah, that is just what I do not understand. It is inexplicable. Stupid. They have all their arrangements made, and very good arrangements too, for the abduction, and yet they imperil the whole affair by a melodramatic attack worthy of a cinema and quite as unreal. It is almost impossible to believe in it, with its band of masked men not 20 m from London." "Perhaps they were two quite separate attempts which happened irrespective of each other," I suggested. "Ah no, that would be too much of a coincidence." "Then further, who was the traitor?" "There must have been a traitor in the first affair anyway." "But who was it? Daniels or O'Murphy?" It must have been one of the two. Or why did the car leave the main road? We cannot suppose that the Prime Minister connived at his own assassination. Did O'Murphy take that turning of his own accord, or was it Daniels who told him to do so? Surely it must have been O'Murphy's doing, yes, because if it was Daniels's, the Prime Minister would have heard the order and would have asked the reason. But there are altogether too many whys in this affair, and they contradict each other. If O'Murphy is an honest man, why did he leave the main road? But if he was a dishonest man, why did he start the car again when only 2 shots had been fired, thereby in all probability saving the Prime Minister's life? And again, if he was honest, why did he, immediately on leaving Charing Cross, drive to a well-known rendezvous of German spies? It looks bad. I said, let us look at the case with method. What have we for and against these 2 men? Take O'Murphy first. Against, that his conduct in leaving the main road was suspicious, that he is an Irishman from County Clare, that he has disappeared in a highly suggestive manner. For, that his promptness in restarting the car saved the Premier's life, that he is a Scotland Yard man and obviously, from the post allotted to him, a trusted detective. Now for Daniels. There is not much against him except the fact that nothing is known of his antecedents and that he speaks too many languages for a good Englishman. Pardon me, mon ami, but as linguists, you are deplorable. Now for him, we have the fact that he was found gagged, bound, and chloroformed, which does not look as though he had anything to do with the matter. He might have gagged and bound himself to divert suspicion. Poirot shook his head. The French police would make no mistake of that kind. Besides, once he had attained his object and the Prime Minister was safely abducted, there would not be much point in his remaining behind his accomplices. Could have gagged and chloroformed him, of course, but I fail to see what object they hoped to accomplish by it. He can be of little use to them now, for until the circumstances concerning the Prime Minister have been cleared up, he is bound to be closely watched. Perhaps he hoped to start the police on a false scent. Then why did he not do so? He merely says that something was pressed over his nose and mouth and that he remembers nothing more. There is no false scent there. It sounds remarkably like the truth. Well, I said, glancing at the clock, I suppose we'd better start for the station. You may find more clues in France. Possibly, mon ami, but I doubt it. It is still incredible to me that the Prime Minister has not been discovered in that limited area where the difficulty of concealing him must be tremendous. If the military and the police of 2 countries have not found him, how shall I? At Charing Cross, we were met by Mr. Dodge. This is Detective Barnes of Scotland Yard and Major Norman. They will hold themselves entirely at your disposal. Good luck to you. It's a bad business, but I've not given up hope. Must be off now, and the minister strode rapidly away. We chatted in a desultory fashion with Major Norman. In the center of the little group of men on the platform, I recognized a little ferret-faced fellow talking to a tall fair man. He was an old acquaintance of Poirot, a detective inspector supposed to be one of the smartest of Scotland Yard's officers. He came over and greeted my friend cheerfully. I heard you were on this job too. Smart bit of work so far. They've got away with the goods all right, but I can't believe they can keep him hidden long. Our people are going through France with a tooth comb. So are the French. I can't help feeling it's only a matter of hours now, that is, if he's still alive," remarked the tall detective gloomily. Japp's face fell. "Yes, but somehow I've got the feeling he's alive all right." Poirot nodded. Yes, he's alive. But can he be found in time? I, like you, did not believe he could be hidden so long. The whistle blew, and we all trooped up into the Pullman car. Then, with a slow, unwilling jerk, the train drew out of the station. It was a curious journey. The Scotland Yard men crowded together, maps of northern France were spread out, and eager forefingers traced the lines of roads and villages. Each man had his own pet theory. Poirot showed none of his usual loquacity but sat staring in front of him with an expression on his face that reminded me of a puzzled child. I talked to Norman, whom I found quite an amusing fellow. On arriving at Dover, Poirot's behavior moved me to intense amusement. The little man, as he went on board the boat, clutched desperately at my arm. The wind was blowing lustily. "Ah," he murmured, "this is terrible." "Have courage, Poirot," I cried. "You will succeed. You will find him, I am sure of it." "Ah, mon ami, you mistake my emotion. It is this villainous sea that troubles me. The mal de mer, it is horrible suffering." "Oh," I said, rather taken aback. The first throb of the engines was felt, and Poirot groaned and closed his eyes. "Major Norman has a map of northern France if you would like to study it." Poirot shook his head impatiently. But no. Leave me, my friend. See you, to think the stomach and the brain must be in harmony. Norman has a method most excellent for averting the mal de mer. You breathe in and out slowly, so, turning the head from left to right and counting 6 between each breath. I left him to his gymnastic endeavors and went on deck. As we came slowly into Boulogne harbor, Poirot appeared, neat and smiling, and announced to me in a whisper that Norman's system had succeeded marvelously. Japp's forefinger was still tracing imaginary routes on his map. Nonsense. The car started from Boulogne, here they branched off. Now, my idea is that they transferred the Prime Minister to another car. See? Well, said the tall detective, I shall make for the seaports. 10 to 1 they've smuggled him on board a ship. He shook his head. Too obvious. The order went out at once to close all the ports. The day was just breaking as we landed. Major Norman touched Poirot on the arm. There's a military car here waiting for you, sir. Thank you, my friend, but for the moment, I do not propose to leave Boulogne. What? No. We will enter this hotel here. By the key, he suited the action to the word. Demanded, and was accorded a private room. We 3 followed him, puzzled and uncomprehending. He shot a quick glance at us. It is not so that the good detective should act, eh? I perceive your thought. He must be full of energy. He must rush to and fro. He should prostrate himself on the dusty road and seek the marks of tires through a little glass. He must gather up the cigarette end, the fallen match. That is your idea, is it not? His eyes challenged us. But I, Poirot, tell you that it is not so. The true clues are within here. He tapped his forehead. See you, I need not have left London. It would have been sufficient for me to sit quietly in my rooms there. All that matters is the little gray cells within. Secretly and silently, they do their part until suddenly I call for a map, and I lay my finger on a spot and I say, the Prime Minister is there, and it is so. With method and logic, one can accomplish anything. This frantic rushing to France was a mistake. It is playing a child's game of hide and seek. But now, though it may be too late, I will set to work the right way from within. Silence, my friends, I beg of you. And for 5 long hours, the little man sat, motionless, blinking his eyelids like a cat, his green eyes flickering and becoming steadily greener and greener. The Scotland Yard man was obviously contemptuous. Major Norman was bored and impatient, and I myself found the time pass with wearisome slowness. Finally, I got up and strolled as noisily as I could to the window. The matter was becoming a farce. I was secretly concerned for my friend. If he failed, I would have preferred him to fail in a less ridiculous manner. Out of the window, I idly watched the Daily Leaf boat belching forth columns of smoke as she lay alongside the quay. Suddenly, I was aroused by Pow's voice close to my elbow. Mess Amos, let us start. I turned. An extraordinary transformation had come over my friend. His eyes were flickering with excitement, his chest was swelled to the uttermost. I have been an imbecile, my friends, but I see daylight at last. Major Norman moved hastily to the door. I'll order the car. There is no need. I shall not use it. Thank heaven the wind has fallen. Do you mean you are going to walk, sir? No, my young friend. I am no St. Peter, I prefer to cross the sea by boat. To cross the sea? Yes. To work with method, one must begin from the beginning, and the beginning of this affair was in England. Therefore, we returned to England. At 3 o'clock, we stood once more upon Charing Cross platform. To all our expostulations, Pow turned a deaf ear and reiterated again and again that to start at the beginning was not a waste of time but the only way. On the way over, he had conferred with Norman in a low voice, and the latter had dispatched a sheaf of telegrams from Dover. Owing to the special passes held by Norman, we got through everywhere in record time. In London, a large police car was waiting for us with some plainclothes men, one of whom handed a typewritten sheet of paper. To my friend, he answered my inquiring glance. A list of the cottage hospitals within a certain radius west of London. I wired for it. From Dew we were whirled rapidly through the London streets. We were on the Bath Road. On we went through Hammersmith, Chiswick, and Brentford. I began to see our objective through Windsor and on to Ascot. My heart gave a leap. Ascot was where Daniels had an aunt living. We were after him then, not O'Murphy. We duly stopped at the gate of a trim villa. Poirot jumped out and rang the bell. I saw a perplexed frown dimming the radiance of his face. Plainly, he was not satisfied. The bell was answered. He was ushered inside. In a few moments, he reappeared and climbed into the car with a short, sharp shake of his head. My hopes began to die down. It was past 4 now. Even if he found certain evidence incriminating Daniels, what would be the good of it unless he could wring from someone the exact spot in France where they were holding the Prime Minister? Our return progress towards London was an interrupted one. We deviated from the main road more than once and occasionally stopped at a small building which I had no difficulty in recognizing as a cottage hospital. Poirot only spent a few minutes at each, but at every halt, his radiant assurance was more and more restored. He whispered something to Norman, to which the latter replied, "Yes, if you turn off to the left, you will find them waiting by the bridge." We turned up a side road, and in the failing light, I discerned a second car waiting by the side of the road. It contained 2 men in plain clothes. Poirot got down and spoke to them, and then we started off in a northerly direction, the other car following close behind. We drove for some time, our objective being obviously one of the northern suburbs of London. Finally, we drove up to the front door of a tall house standing a little back from the road in its own grounds. Norman and I were left with the car. Pooh and one of the detectives went up to the door and rang. A neat parlor maid opened it. The detective spoke. "I am a police officer, and I have a warrant to search this house." The girl gave a little scream, and a tall, handsome woman of middle age appeared behind her in the hall. "Shut the door, Edith. They are burglars, I expect." But Pooh swiftly inserted his foot in the door and, at the same moment, blew a whistle. Instantly, the other detectives ran up and poured into the house, shutting the door behind them. Norman and I spent about 5 minutes cursing our forced inactivity. Finally, the door reopened, and the men emerged escorting 3 prisoners, a woman and 2 men. The woman and one of the men were taken to the second car. The other man was placed in our car by Pooh himself. "I must go with the others, my friend, but have great care of this gentleman." "You do not know him?" "No." "Ian, let me present to you Muir O.M. Murphy." "Oh, Murphy." I gaped at him open-mouthed as we started again. He was not handcuffed, but I did not fancy he would try to escape. He sat there staring in front of him as though dazed. Anyway, Norman and I would be more than a match for him. To my surprise, we still kept a northerly route. We were not returning to London then? I was much puzzled. Suddenly, as the car slowed down, I recognized that we were close to Hendon Aerodrome. Immediately, I grasped Pooh's idea. He proposed to reach France by aeroplane. It was a sporting idea, but on the face of it, impracticable. A telegram would be far quicker. Time was everything. He must leave the personal glory of rescuing the Prime Minister to others. As we drew up, Major Norman jumped out, and a plainclothed man took his place. He conferred with Poirot for a few minutes and then went off briskly. I too jumped. out and caught Poirot by the arm. "I congratulate you, old fellow. They have told you the hiding place. But look here, you must wire to France at once. You'll be too late if you go yourself." Poirot looked at me curiously for a minute or two. "Unfortunately, my friend, there are some things that cannot be sent by telegram." At that moment, Major Norman returned, accompanied by a young officer in the uniform of the Flying Corps. "This is Captain Lowe, who will fly you over to France. He can start at once." "Wrap up warmly, sir," said the young pilot. "I can lend you a coat if you like." Poirot was consulting his enormous watch. He murmured to himself, "Yes, there is time, just time." Then he looked up and bowed politely to the young officer. "I thank you, monsieur, but it is not I who am your passenger. It is this gentleman here." He moved a little aside as he spoke, and a figure came forward out of the darkness. It was the second male prisoner who had gone in the other car, and as the light fell on his face, I gave a gasp of surprise. It was the Prime Minister. "For heaven's sake, tell me all about it," I cried impatiently as Poirot, Norman, and I motored back to London. "How in the world did they manage to smuggle him back to England?" "There was no need to smuggle him back," replied Poirot dryly. "The Prime Minister has never left England. He was kidnapped on his way from Windsor to London." "What?" "I will make all clear. The Prime Minister was in his car, his secretary beside him. Suddenly, a pad of chloroform is clapped on his face. But by whom? By the clever linguistic Captain Daniels. As soon as the Prime Minister is unconscious, Daniels picks up the speaking tube and directs O'Murphy to turn to the right, which the chauffeur, quite unsuspicious, does. A few yards down that unfrequented road a large car is standing, apparently broken down. Its driver signals to O'Murphy to stop. O'Murphy slows up. The stranger approaches. Daniels leans out of the window and, probably with the aid of an instantaneous anesthetic such as ethyl chloride, the chloroform trick is repeated. In a few seconds, the two helpless men are dragged out and transferred to the other car, and a pair of substitutes take their places. Impossible? Padu, have you not seen music hall turns imitating celebrities with marvelous accuracy? Nothing is easier than to personate a public character. The Prime Minister of England is far easier to understudy than Mr. John Smith of Clapham, say. As for O'Murphy's double, no one was going to take much notice of him until after the departure of the Prime Minister, and by then he would have made himself scarce. He drives straight from Charing Cross to the meeting place of his friends. He goes in as O'Murphy. He emerges as someone quite different. O'Murphy has disappeared, leaving a conveniently suspicious trail behind him. But the man who personated the Prime Minister was seen by everyone. He was not seen by anyone who knew him privately or intimately, and Daniel shielded him from contact with anyone as much as possible. Moreover, his face was bandaged up, and anything unusual in his manner would be put down to the fact that he was suffering from shock as a result of the attempt upon his life. Mr. McAdam has a weak throat and always spares his voice as much as possible before any great speech. The deception was perfectly easy to keep up as far as France. There, it would be impracticable and impossible, so the Prime Minister disappears. The police of this country hurry across the channel, and no one bothers. To go into the details of the first attack to sustain the illusion that the abduction has taken place in France, Daniels is gagged and chloroformed in a convincing manner, and the man who has enacted the part of the Prime Minister rids himself of his disguise. He and the bogus chauffeur may be arrested as suspicious characters, but no one will dream of suspecting their real part in the drama, and they will eventually be released for lack of evidence. And the real Prime Minister? He and O'Murphy were driven straight to the house of Mrs. Everard at Hampstead, Daniel's so-called aunt. In reality, she is Frau Barreth, and the police have been looking for her for some time. It is a valuable little present that I have made to them. To say nothing of Daniels. Ah, it was a clever plan, but he did not reckon on the cleverness of Hercule Poirot. I think my friend might well be excused his moment of vanity. When did you first begin to suspect the truth of the matter? When I began to work the right way from within. I could not make that shooting affair fit in, but when I saw that the net result of it was that the Prime Minister went to France with his face bound up, I began to comprehend. And when I visited all the cottage hospitals between Windsor and London and found that no one answering to my description had had his face bound up and dressed that morning, I was sure. After that, it was child's play for a mind like mine. The following morning, Poirot showed me a telegram he had just received. It had no place of origin and wasn't signed. It ran, in time. Later in the day, the evening papers published an account of the Allied conference. They laid particular stress on the magnificent ovation accorded to Mr. David McAdam, whose inspiring speech had produced a deep and lasting impression. Agatha Christie, The Adventure of the Sinister Stranger. It's been a darn dull day, said Tommy and yawned widely. Nearly tea time, said Tuppence and also yawned. Business was not brisk in the International Detective Agency. The eagerly expected letter from the ham merchant had not arrived, and bona fide cases were not forthcoming. Albert, the office boy, entered with a sealed package which he laid on the table. The mystery of the sealed packet, murmured Tommy. Did it contain the fabulous pearls of the Russian Grand Duchess, or was it an infernal machine destined to blow Blunt's brilliant detectives to pieces? As a matter of fact, said Tuppence, tearing open the package. It's my wedding present to Frances Haviland. Rather nice, isn't it? Tommy took a slender silver cigarette case from her outstretched hand, noted the inscription engraved in her own handwriting, Frances from Tuppence, opened and shut the case, and nodded approvingly. You do throw your money about, Tuppence, he remarked. I'll have one like it, only in gold, for my birthday next month. Fancy wasting a thing like that on Frances Haviland, who always was and always will be one of the most perfect asses God ever made. You forget I used to drive him about during the war when he was a general. Ah, those were the good old days, she said. They were, agreed Tommy. Beautiful women used to come and squeeze my hand in hospital. I remember. But I don't send them all wedding presents. I don't believe the bride will care much for this gift of yours, Tuppence. It's nice and slim for the pocket, isn't it? Said Tuppence, disregarding his remarks. Tommy slipped it into his own pocket. Just right, he said approvingly. Hello, here is Albert with the afternoon post. Very possibly the Duchess of Paris is commissioning us to find her prize Pekingese. They sorted through the letters together. Suddenly, Tommy gave vent to a prolonged whistle and held up one of them in his hand, a blue letter with a Russian stamp on it. Do you remember what the chief said? We were to look out for letters like that. How exciting, said Tuppence. Something has happened at last. Open it and see if the contents are up to schedule. A ham merchant, wasn't it? Half a minute, we shall want some milk for tea. They forgot to leave it this morning. I'll send Albert out for it. She returned from the outer office after dispatching Albert on his errand to find Tommy holding the blue sheet of paper in his hand. As we thought, Tuppence, he remarked, almost word for word what the chief said. Tuppence took the letter from him and read it. It was couched in careful, stilted English and purported to be from one Gregor Theodori, who was anxious for news of his wife. The International Detective Agency was urged to spare no expense in doing their utmost to trace her. Theodori himself was unable to leave Russia at the moment owing to a crisis in the pork trade. I wonder what it really means, said Tuppence thoughtfully, smoothing out the sheet on the table in front of her. Code of some kind, I suppose, said Tommy. That's not our business. Our business is to hand it over to the chief as soon as possible. Better just verify it by soaking off the stamp and seeing if the number 16 is underneath. All right, said Tuppence, but I should think. She stopped dead, and Tommy, surprised by her sudden pause, looked up to see a man's burly figure blocking the doorway. The intruder was a man of commanding presence, squarely built, with a very round head and a powerful jaw. He might have been about 45 years of age. I must beg your pardon, said the stranger, advancing into the room, hat in hand. I found your outer office empty and this door open, so I ventured to intrude. This is Blunt's International Detective Agency, is it not? Certainly. It is, and you are perhaps Mr. Blunt? Mr. Theodore Blunt? I am Mr. Blunt. You wish to consult me? This is my secretary, Miss Robinson. Tuppence inclined her head gracefully but continued to scrutinize the stranger narrowly through her downcast eyelashes. She was wondering how long he had been standing in the doorway and how much he had seen and heard. It did not escape her observation that, even while he was talking to Tommy, his eyes kept coming back to the blue paper in her hand. Tommy's voice, sharp with a warning note, recalled her to the needs of the moment. Miss Robinson, please take notes. Now, sir, will you kindly state the matter on which you wish to have my advice? Tuppence reached for her pad and pencil. The big man began in rather a harsh voice. My name is Bauer, Dr. Charles Bauer. I live in Hamad, where I have a practice. I have come to you, Mr. Blunt, because several rather strange occurrences have happened lately. Yes, Dr. Bauer? Twice in the course of the last week, I have been summoned by telephone to an urgent case, in each case to find that the summons has been a fake. The first time, I thought a practical joke had been played upon me, but on my return the second time, I found that some of my private papers had been displaced and disarranged, and I now believe that the same thing had happened the first time. I made an exhaustive search and came to the conclusion that my whole desk had been thoroughly ransacked and the various papers replaced hurriedly. Dr. Bauer paused and gazed at Tommy. Well, Mr. Blunt? Well, Dr. Bauer, replied the young man, smiling, what do you think of it, eh? Well, first I should like the facts. What do you keep in your desk? My private papers. Exactly. Now, what do those private papers consist of? What value are they to the common thief? Or any particular person to the common thief? I cannot see that they would have any value at all. But my notes on certain obscure alkaloids would be of interest to anyone possessed of technical knowledge on the subject. I have been making a study of such matters for the last few years. These alkaloids are deadly and virulent poisons and are, in addition, almost untraceable. They yield no known reactions. The secret of them would be worth money then to unscrupulous persons. Yes, and you suspect whom? The doctor shrugged his massive shoulders. As far as I can tell, the house was not entered forcibly from the outside. That seems to point to some member of my household, and yet I cannot believe, he broke off abruptly. Then began again, his face very grave. Mr. Blunt, I must place myself in your hands unreservedly. I dare not go to the police. In the matter of my 3 servants, I am almost entirely sure they have served me long and faithfully. Still, one never knows. Then I have living with me my 2 nephews, Bertram and Henry. Henry is a good boy, a very good boy. He has never caused me any anxiety, an excellent, hard-working young fellow. Bertram, I regret to say, is of quite a different character, wild, extravagant, and persistently idle. I see, said Tommy thoughtfully. You suspect your nephew Bertram of being mixed up in this business? Now, I don't agree with you. I suspect the good boy. Henry. But why? Tradition. Precedent. Tommy waved his hand airily. In my experience, the suspicious characters are always innocent, and vice versa, my dear sir. Yes, decidedly, I suspect Henry. Excuse me, Mr. Blunt, said Tuppence, interrupting in a deferential voice, did I understand Dr. Bauer to say that these notes on obscure alkaloids are kept in the desk with the other papers? They are kept in the desk, my dear young lady, but in a secret drawer, the position of which is known only to myself. Hence, they have so far defied the search. And what exactly do you want me to do? Dr. Bauer asked Tommy. Do you anticipate that a further search will be made? I do, Mr. Blunt. I have every reason to believe so. This afternoon I received a telegram from a patient of mine whom I ordered to Bournemouth a few weeks ago. The telegram states that my patient is in a critical condition and begs me to come down at once. Rendered suspicious by the events I have told you of, I myself dispatched a telegram, prepaid, to the patient in question and elicited the fact that he was in good health and had sent no summons to me of any kind. It occurred to me that if I pretended to have been taken in and duly departed to Bournemouth, we should have a very good chance of finding the miscreant at work. They or he will doubtless wait until the household has retired to bed before commencing operations. I suggest that you should meet me outside my house at 11 o'clock this evening, and we will investigate the matter together, hoping, in fact, to catch them in the act. Tommy drummed thoughtfully on the table with a paper knife. Your plan seems to me an excellent one, Dr. Bauer. I cannot see any hitch in it. Let me see. Your address is the Larches, Hangman's Lane. Rather a lonely part, I'm afraid, but we command magnificent views over the heath. Quite so, said Tommy. The visitor rose. Then I shall expect you tonight, Mr. Blunt, outside the Larches at, shall we say, 5 minutes to 11 o'clock, to be on the safe side? Certainly, 5 minutes to 11 o'clock. Good afternoon, Dr. Bauer. Tommy rose, pressed the buzzer on his desk, and Albert appeared to show the client out. The doctor walked with a decided limp, but his powerful physique was evident in spite of it. An ugly customer to tackle, murmured Tommy to himself. Well, Tuppen, old girl, what do you think of it? I'll tell you in one word, said Tuppen. Clubfoot. What? I said, clubfoot. My study of the classics is not been in vain, Tommy. This thing's a plant, obscure alkaloids indeed. I never heard a weaker story. Even I did not find it very convincing, admitted her husband. Did you see his eyes on the letter, Tommy? He's one of the gang. They've got wise to the fact that you're not the real Mr. Blunt, and they're out for our blood. In that case, said Tommy, opening the side cupboard and surveying his rows of books with an affectionate eye, our role is easy to select. We are the brothers Oakwood, and I am Desmond, he added firmly. Tuppence shrugged her shoulders. All right, have it your own way. I'd just as soon be Francis. Francis was much the more intelligent of the two. Desmond always gets into a mess. And Francis turns up as the gardener or something in the nick of time and saves the situation. Ah, said Tommy, but I shall be a super Desmond. When I arrive at the Larches, Tuppence interrupted him unceremoniously. You're not going to Hampstead tonight. Why not? Walk into a trap with your eyes shut? No, my dear girl, walk into a trap with my eyes open. There's a lot of difference. I think our friend Dr. Bauer will get a little surprise. I don't like it, said Tuppence. You know what happens when Desmond disobeys the chief's orders and acts on his own. Our orders were quite clear, to send on the letters at once and to report immediately on anything that happened. You've not got it quite right, said Tommy. We were to report immediately if anyone came in and mentioned the number 16. Nobody has. That's a quibble, said Tuppence. It's no good. I've got a fancy for playing a lone hand, my dear old Tense. I shall be all right. I shall go armed to the teeth. The essence of the whole thing is that I shall be on my guard, and they won't know it. The chief will be patting me on the back for a good night's work. Well, said Tuppence, I don't like it. That man's as strong as a gorilla. Ah, said Tommy, but think of my blue-nosed automatic. The door of the outer office opened, and Albert appeared, closing the door behind him. He approached Dad and them with an envelope in his hand. A gentleman to see you, said Albert. When I began the usual stunt of saying you were engaged with Scotland Yard, he told me he knew all about that, said he came from Scotland Yard himself, and he wrote something on a card and stuck it up in this envelope." Tommy took the envelope and opened it. As he read the card, a grin passed across his face. "The gentleman was amusing himself at your expense by speaking the truth, Albert," he remarked. "Show him in." He tossed the card to Tuppence. It bore the name Detective Inspector Dymchurch, and across it was scrolled in pencil, "A friend of Marriott's." In another minute, the Scotland Yard detective was entering the inner office. In appearance, Inspector Dymchurch was of the same type as Inspector Marriott, short and thickset, with shrewd eyes. "Good afternoon," said the detective breezily. "Marriott's away in South Wales, but before he went, he asked me to keep an eye on you two and on this place in general." "Oh, bless you, sir," he went on as Tommy seemed about to interrupt him. "We know all about it. It's not our department, and we don't interfere, but somebody's got wise lately to the fact that all is not what it seems. You've had a gentleman here this afternoon. I don't know what he called himself, and I don't know what his real name is, but I know just a little about him, enough to want to know more. Am I right in assuming that he made a date with you for some particular spot this evening?" "Quite right. I thought as much. 16 West Ram Road, Finsbury Park, was that it?" "You're wrong there," said Tommy with a smile. "Dead wrong. The Larches, Hampstead." Dymchurch seemed honestly taken aback. Clearly, he had not expected this. "I don't understand it," he muttered. "It must be a new layout. The Larches, Hampstead. You said yes and to meet him there at 11 o'clock tonight." "Don't you do it, sir," there burst from Tuppence. Tommy flushed. "If you think, Inspector," he began heatedly, but the inspector raised a soothing hand. "I'll tell you what I think, Mr. Blunt. The place you want to be at 11 o'clock tonight is here in this office." "What?" cried Tuppence, astonished. "Here? In this office? Never mind how I know. Departments overlap sometimes. But you got one of those famous blue letters today. Old What's-his-name is after that. He lures you up to Hampstead, makes quite sure of your being out of the way, and steps in here at night when all the building is empty and quiet to have a good search round at his leisure. But why should he think the letter would be here? He'd know I should have it on me or else have passed it on. Begging your pardon, sir, that's just what he wouldn't know. He may have tumbled to the fact that you're not the original Mr. Blunt, but he probably thinks that you're a bona fide gentleman who bought the business. In that case, the letter would be all in the way of regular business and would be filed as such." "I see," said Tuppence. "And that's just what we've got to let him think. We'll catch him red-handed here tonight." "So that's the plan, is it?" "Yes. It's the chance of a lifetime. Now let me see, what's the time?" 6 o'clock. What time do you usually leave here, sir?" "About 6. You must seem to leave the place as usual." "Actually, we'll sneak back to it as soon as possible. I don't believe they'll come here till about 11, but of course, they might. If you'll excuse me, I'll just go and take a look around outside and see if I can make out anyone watching the place." Dymchurch departed, and Tommy began an argument with Tuppence. It lasted some time and was heated and acrimonious. In the end, Tuppence suddenly capitulated. "All right," she said. "I give in. I'll go home and sit there like a good little girl, whilst you tackle crooks and nob with detectives. But you wait, young man, I'll be even with you yet for keeping me out of the fun." Dymchurch returned at that moment. "Coast seems clear enough," he said, "but you can't tell. Better seem to leave in the usual manner. They won't go on watching the place once you've gone." Tommy called Albert and gave him instructions to lock up. Then the four of them made their way to the garage nearby where the car was usually left. Tuppence drove, and Albert sat beside her. Tommy and the detective sat behind. Presently, they were held up by a block in the traffic. Tuppence looked over her shoulder and nodded. Tommy and the detective opened the right-hand door and stepped out into the middle of Oxford Street. In a minute or two, Tuppence drove on. "Better not go in just yet," said Dymchurch as he and Tommy hurried into Hallam Street. "You got the key all right?" Tommy nodded. "Then what about a bite of dinner? It's early, but there's a little place here right opposite. We'll get a table by the window so that we can watch the place all the time." They had a very welcome little meal in the manner the detective had suggested. Tommy found Inspector Dymchurch quite an entertaining companion. Most of his official work had lain amongst international spies, and he had tales to tell which astonished his simple listener. They remained in the little restaurant until 8 o'clock when Dymchurch suggested a move. "It's quite dark now, sir," he explained. "We shall be able to slip in without anyone being the wiser." It was, as he said, quite dark. They crossed the road, looked quickly up and down the deserted street, and slipped inside the entrance. Then they mounted the stairs, and Tommy inserted his key in the lock of the outer office. Just as he did so, he heard, as he thought, Dymchurch whistle beside him. "What are you whistling for?" he asked. Sharply, "I didn't whistle," said Dymchurch, very much astonished. "I thought you did." "Well, someone," began Tommy. He got no further. Strong arms seized him from behind, and before he could cry out, a pat of something sweet and sickly was pressed over his mouth and nose. He struggled valiantly, but in vain. The chloroform did its work. His head began to whirl, and the floor heaved up and down in front of him. Choking, he lost consciousness. He came to himself painfully but in full possession of his faculties. The chloroform had been only a whiff. They had kept him under long enough to force a gag into his mouth and ensure that he did not cry out when he came to himself. He was half lying, half sitting, propped against the wall in a corner of his own inner office. Two men were busily turning out the contents of the desk and ransacking the cupboards, and as they worked, they cursed freely. "Swell me, Governor," said the taller of the two. "Helly, we've turned the whole bloody place upside down and inside out. It's not there." "It must be here," snarled the other. "It isn't on him, and there's no other place it can be." As he spoke, he turned, and to Tommy's utter amazement, he saw that the last speaker was none other than Inspector Dymchurch. The latter grinned when he saw Tommy's astonished face. "So our young friend is awake again," he said, "and a little surprised?" "Yes, a little surprised. But it was so simple. We suspect that all is not as it should be with the International Detective Agency. I volunteer to find out if that is so or not. If the new Mr. Blunt is indeed a spy, he will be suspicious. So I send first my dear old friend Karl Bauer. Karl is told to act suspiciously and pitch an improbable tale. He does so, and then I appear on the scene. I use the name of Inspector Marriott to gain confidence. The rest is easy." He laughed. Tommy was dying to say several things, but the gag in his mouth prevented him. Also, he was dying to do several things, mostly with his hands and feet, but alas, that too had been attended to. He was securely bound. The thing that amazed him most was the astounding change in the man standing over him. As Inspector Dymchurch, the fellow had been a typical Englishman. Now, no one could have mistaken him for a moment for anything but a well-educated foreigner who talked English perfectly without a trace of accent. "Coggins, my good friend," said the UR while addressing his ruffianly-looking associate, "take your life-preserver and stand by the prisoner. I'm going to remove the gag. You understand, my dear Mr. Blunt, do you not, that it would be criminally foolish on your part to cry out? But I am sure you do. For your age, you are quite an intelligent lad." Very deftly, he removed the gag and stepped back. Tommy eased his stiff jaws, rolled his tongue around his mouth, swallowed twice, and said nothing at all. "I congratulate you on your restraint," said the other. "You appreciate the position, I see. Have you nothing at all to say?" "What I have to say will keep," said Tommy, "and it won't spoil by waiting." "Ah, what I have to say will not keep. In plain English, Mr. Blunt, where is that letter?" "My dear fellow, I don't know," said Tommy cheerfully. "I haven't got it, but you know that as well as I do. I should go on looking about if I were you. I like to see you and friend Coggins playing hide-and-seek together." The other's face darkened. "You are pleased to be flippant, Mr. Blunt. You see that square box over there? That is a little outfit. In it, there is vitriol, yes, vitriol, and irons that can be heated in the fire so that they are red hot and burn." Tommy shook his head sadly. "An error in diagnosis," he murmured. "Tuppence and I labeled this adventure wrong. It's not a Clubfoot story, it's a Bulldog Drummond, and you are the inimitable Karl." Property scowling, the man brought it to hire and provided a sheet of paper. "Be careful what you say," Dymchurch said menacingly. "We leave it to you, but failure means death, and slow death at that." "In that case," said Tommy, "I will certainly do my best." He reflected a minute or two, then began to scribble rapidly. "How will this do?" he asked, handing over the completed epistle. "Dear Tuppence, can you come along at once and bring that blue letter with you? We want to decode it here and now. In haste, Francis." "Francis?" queried the bogus inspector with lifted eyebrows. "Was that the name she called you, as you weren't at my christening?" said Tommy. "I don't suppose you can know whether it's my name or not. But I think this cigarette case you took from my pocket is a pretty good proof that I'm speaking the truth. the other stepped over to the table and took up the case. He read Francis from tuppence with a faint grin and laid it down again. "I am glad to find you are behaving so sensibly," he said. "Coggins, give that note to Vasile. He is on guard outside. Tell him to take it at once." The next 20 minutes passed slowly. The 10 minutes after that, more slowly still. Dymchurch was striding up and down, with a face that grew darker and darker. Once, he turned menacingly on Tommy. "If you have dared to double-cross us," he growled, "if we'd had a pack of cards here, we might have had a game of piquet to pass the time." Drawled Tommy. "Women always keep one waiting." "I hope you're not going to be unkind to little tuppence when she comes." "Oh no," said Dymchurch. "We shall arrange for you to go to the same place together. Will you, you swine?" said Tommy under his breath. Suddenly, there was a stir in the outer office. A man whom Tommy had not yet seen poked his head in and growled something in Russian. "Good," said Dymchurch. "She is coming, and coming alone." For a moment, a faint anxiety caught at Tommy's heart. The next minute, he heard Tuppence's voice. "Oh, there you are, Inspector Dymchurch. I've brought the letter. Where is Francis?" With the last words, she came through the door, and Basile sprang on her from behind, clapping his hand over her mouth. Dymchurch tore the handbag from her grasp and turned over its contents in a frenzied search. Suddenly, he uttered an ejaculation of delight and held up a blue envelope with a Russian stamp on it. Coggins gave a hoarse shout, and just in that minute of triumph, the other door, the door into Tuppence's own office, opened noiselessly, and Inspector Marriott and 2 men armed with revolvers stepped into the room with the sharp command, "Hands up." There was no fight. The others were taken at a hopeless disadvantage. Dymchurch's automatic lay on the table, and the 2 others were not armed. "A very nice little haul," said Inspector Marriott with approval as he snapped on the last pair of handcuffs, "and we'll have more as time goes on, I hope." White with rage, Dymchurch glared at Tuppence. "You little devil," he snarled. "It was you who put them on to us." "It wasn't all my doing, I admit," said Tuppence. "I ought to have guessed, when you brought in the number 16 this afternoon. But it was Tommy's note that clinched matters. I rang up Inspector Marriott, got Albert to meet him with the duplicate key of the office, and came along myself with the empty blue envelope in my bag. The letter I forwarded according to my instructions as soon as I had parted from you 2 this afternoon." But one word had caught the other's attention. "Tommy?" he queried. Tommy, who had just been released from his bonds, came towards them. "Well done, Brother Francis," he said to Tuppence, taking both her hands in his. "And to Dymchurch, as I told you, my dear fellow, you really ought to read the classics Agatha Christie, The Ambassador's Boots." my dear fellow," said Tuppence, and waved a heavily buttered muffin. Tommy looked at her for a minute or 2, then a broad grin spread over his face and he murmured, "We do have to be so very careful." "That's right," said Tuppence, delighted. "You guessed. I am the famous Dr. Fortune, and you are Superintendent Bell." "Why are you being Reginald Fortune?" "Well, really because I feel like a lot of hot butter." "That is the pleasant side of it," said Tommy, "but there is another." You will have to examine horribly smashed faces and very extra dead bodies a good deal. In answer, Tuppence threw across a letter. Tommy's eyebrows rose in astonishment. Randolph Wilmot, the American ambassador. I wonder what he wants. We shall know tomorrow at 11 o'clock, punctually to the time named. Mr. Randolph Wilmot, United States Ambassador to the Court of St. James, was ushered into Mr. Blunt's office. He cleared his throat and commenced speaking in a deliberate and characteristic manner. I have come to you, Mr. Blunt. By the way, it is Mr. Blunt himself to whom I am speaking, is it not? Certainly, said Tommy. I am Theodore Blunt, the head of the firm. I always prefer to deal with heads of departments, said Mr. Wilmot. It is more satisfactory in every way. As I was about to say, Mr. Blunt, this business gets my goat. There's nothing in it to trouble Scotland Yard about. I'm not a penny the worse in any way, and it's probably all due to a simple mistake. But all the same, I don't see just how that mistake arose. There's nothing criminal in it, I dare say, but I'd like just to get the thing straightened out. It makes me mad not to see the why and wherefore of a thing. Absolutely, said Tommy. Mr. Wilmot went on. He was slow and given to much detail. At last, Tommy managed to get a word in. Quite so, he said. The position is this: you arrived by the liner Nomadic a week ago. In some way, your kit bag and the kit bag of another gentleman, Mr. Ralph Westram, whose initials are the same as yours, got mixed up. You took Mr. Westram's kit bag. Or two, then a broad grin spread over his face and he murmured, We do have to be so very careful. That's right, said Tuppence, delighted. You guessed. I am the famous Dr. Fortune, and you are Superintendent Bell. Why are you being Reginald Fortune? Well, really because I feel like a lot of hot butter. That is the pleasant side of it, said Tommy, but there is another. You will have to examine horribly smashed faces and very extra dead bodies a good deal. In answer, Tuppence threw across a letter. Tommy's eyebrows rose in astonishment. Randolph Wilmot, the American ambassador. I wonder what he wants. We shall know tomorrow at 11 o'clock, punctually to the time named. Mr. Randolph Wilmot, United States Ambassador to the Court of St. James, was ushered into Mr. Blunt's office. He cleared his throat and commenced speaking in a deliberate and characteristic manner. I have come to you, Mr. Blunt. By the way, it is Mr. Blunt himself to whom I am speaking, is it not? Certainly, said Tommy. I am Theodore Blunt, the head of the firm. I always prefer to deal with heads of departments, said Mr. Wilmot. It is more satisfactory in every way. As I was about to say, Mr. Blunt, this business gets my goat. There's nothing in it to trouble Scotland Yard about. I'm not a penny the worse in any way, and it's probably all due to a simple mistake. But all the same, I don't see just how that mistake arose. There's nothing criminal in it, I dare say, but I'd like just to get the thing straightened out. It makes me mad not to see the why and wherefore of a thing. Absolutely, said Tommy. Mr. Wilmot went on. He was slow and given to much detail. At last, Tommy managed to get a word in. Quite so, he said. The position is this: you arrived by the liner Nomadic a week ago. In some way, your kit bag and the kit bag of another gentleman, Mr. Ralph Westram, whose initials are the same as yours, got mixed up. You took Mr. Westram's kit bag. Yes, said Mr. Wilmot, boots odd, isn't it? You'll forgive my asking you, said Tommy, but you didn't carry any secret papers or anything of that sort sewn in the lining of a boot or screwed into a false heel? The ambassador seemed amused by the question. Secret diplomacy hasn't got to that pitch, I hope. Only in fiction, said Tommy with an answering smile and a slightly apologetic manner. But you see, we've got to account for the thing somehow. Who came for the bag? The other bag, I mean. Supposed to be one of West's servants, quite a quiet ordinary man, so I understand. My valet saw nothing wrong with him. Had it been unpacked, do you know? That I can't say. I presume not. But perhaps you'd like to ask the valet a few questions. He can tell you more than I can about the business. I think that would be the best plan, Mr. Wilmot. The ambassador scribbled a few words on a card and handed it to Tommy. I opine that you would prefer to go around to the embassy and make your inquiries there. If not, I will have the man, his name is Richards, by the way, sent around here. No, thank you, Mr. Wilmot. I should prefer to go to the embassy. The ambassador rose, glancing at his watch. Dear me, I shall be late for an appointment. Well, goodbye, Mr. Blunt. I leave the matter in your hands. He hurried away. Tommy looked at Tuppence, who had been scribbling demurely on her pad in the character of the efficient Miss Robinson. What about it, old thing? He asked. Do you see, as the old bird put it, any rhyme or reason in the proceeding? None whatever, replied Tuppence cheerily. Well, that's a start anyway. It shows that there is really something very deep at the back of it. You think so? It's a generally accepted hypothesis. Remember Sherlock Holmes and the depth the butter had sunk into the parsley, I mean the other way around. I've always had a devouring wish to know all about that case. Perhaps Watson will disinter it from his notebook one of these days, then I shall die happy. But we must get busy. Quite so, said Tuppence. Not a quick man, the esteemed Wilmot, but sure. She knows men, said Tommy. Or do I say he knows men? It is so confusing when you assume the character of a male detective. Oh, my dear fellow, my dear fellow. A little more action, Tuppence, and a little less repetition. A classic phrase cannot be repeated too often, said Tuppence with dignity. Have a muffin, said Tommy kindly. Not at 11 o'clock in the morning, thank you. Silly case, this boots, you know why boots? Well, said Tommy, why not? It doesn't fit. Boots? She shook her head. All wrong. Who wants other people's boots? The whole thing's mad. Perhaps they got hold of the wrong bag, suggested Tommy. That's possible, but if they were after papers, a dispatch case would be more likely. Papers are the only things one thinks of in connection with ambassadors. Boots suggest footprints, said Tommy thoughtfully. Do you think they wanted to lay a trail of Wilmot's footsteps somewhere? Tuppence considered the suggestion, abandoning her role, then shook her head. It seems wildly impossible, she said. No, I believe we shall have to resign ourselves to the fact that the boots have nothing to do with it. Well, said Tommy with a sigh, the next step is to interview friend Richards. He may be able to throw some light on the mystery. On production of the ambassador's card, Tommy was admitted to the embassy, and presently a pale young man with a respectful manner and a subdued voice presented himself to undergo examination. I am Richards, sir, Mr. Wilmot's valet. I understood you wished to see me. Yes, Richards. Mr. Wilmot called on me this morning and suggested that I should come around and ask you a few questions. It is this matter of the kit bag. Mr. Wilmot was rather upset over the affair. I know, sir. I can hardly see why, since no harm was done. I certainly understood from the man who called for the other bag that it belonged to Senator Westram, but of course, I may have been mistaken. What kind of a man was he? Middle-aged, gray hair, very good class, I should say. Most respectable. I understood he was Senator West's valet. He left Mr. Wilmot's bag and took away the other. Had it been unpacked at all? Which one, sir? Well, I meant the one you brought from the boat, but I should like to know about the other as well. Mr. Wilmot's own, had that been unpacked, do you fancy? I should say not, sir. It was just as I strapped it up on the boat. I should say the gentleman, whoever he was, just opened it, realized it wasn't his, and shut it up again. Nothing missing? No small article? I don't think so, sir. In fact, I'm quite sure. And now the other one, had you started to unpack that? As a matter of fact, sir, I was just opening it at the very moment Senator West's man arrived. I had just undone the straps. Did you open it at all? We just unfastened it together, sir, to be sure no mistake had been made this time. The man said it was all right, and he strapped it up again and took it away. What was inside? Boots also? No, sir, mostly toilet things, I fancy. I know I saw a tin of bath salts. Tommy abandoned that line of research. You never saw anyone tampering with anything in your master's cabin on board ship, I suppose? Oh, no. Sir, never. Anything suspicious of any kind? And what do I mean by that, I wonder? He thought to himself with a trace of amusement. Anything suspicious, just words. But the man in front of him hesitated. Now that I remember it, yes. Said Tommy eagerly, what? I don't think it could have anything to do with it, but there was a young lady. Yes, a young lady, you say? What was she doing? She was taken faint, sir. A very pleasant young lady, Miss Eileen O'Hara, her name was. A dainty-looking lady, not tall, with black hair. Just a little foreign-looking, yes, said Tommy with even greater eagerness. As I was saying, she was taken queer just outside Mr. Wilmot's cabin. She asked me to fetch the doctor. I helped her to the sofa and then went off for the doctor. I was some time finding him, and when I found him and brought him back, the young lady was nearly all right again." "Oh," said Tommy, "you don't think, sir?" "It's difficult to know what to think," said Tommy noncommittally. "Was this Miss O'Hara traveling alone?" "Yes, I think so, sir." "You haven't seen her since you landed?" "No, sir." "Well," said Tommy, after a minute or two spent in reflection, "I think that's all." "Thank you, Richards." "Thank you, sir." Back at the office of the detective agency, Tommy retailed his conversation with Richards to Tuppence, who listened attentively. "What do you think of it, Tuppence?" "Oh, my dear fellow, we doctors are always skeptical of a sudden faintness, so very convenient." "And I, as well as O'Hara, almost too impossibly Irish, don't you think? It's something to go upon at last. Do you know what I'm going to do, Tuppence? Advertise for the lady." "What?" "Yes, any information respecting Miss E. O'Hara, known to have traveled on such and such a ship and such a date. Either she'll answer it herself if she's genuine, or someone may come forward to give us information about her. So far, it's the only hope of a clue. You'll also put her on her guard. Remember." "Well," said Tommy, "one's got to risk something." "I still can't see any sense in the thing," said Tuppence, frowning. "If a gang of crooks get hold of the ambassador's bag for an hour or two and then send it back, what possible good can it do them? Unless there are papers in it they want a copy, and Mr. Wilmot swears there was nothing of the kind." Tommy stared at her thoughtfully. "You put these things rather well, Tuppence," he said at last. "You've given me an idea." It was 2 days later. Tuppence was out to lunch. Tommy, alone in the austere office of Mr. Theodore Blunt, was improving his mind by reading the latest sensational thriller. The door of the office opened, and Albert appeared. "A young lady to see you, sir. Miss Cicely March. She says she has called in answer to an advertisement." "Show her in at once," cried Tommy, thrusting his novel into a convenient drawer. In another minute, Albert had ushered in the young lady. Tommy had just time to see that she was fair-haired and extremely pretty when the amazing occurrence happened. The door through which Albert had just passed out was rudely burst open. In the doorway stood a picturesque figure, a big, dark man, Spanish in appearance, with a flaming red tie. His features were distorted with rage, and in his hand was a gleaming pistol. "So this is the office of Mr. Busybody Blunt," he said in perfect English. His voice was low and venomous. "Hands up at once, or I shoot." It sounded no idle threat. Tommy's hands went up obediently. The girl, crouched against the wall, gave a gasp of terror. "This young lady will come with me," said the man. "Yes, you will, my dear. You have never seen me before, but that doesn't matter. I can't have my plans ruined by a silly little chit like you. I seem to remember that you were one of the passengers on the Nomadic. You must have been peering into things that didn't concern you. But I have no intention of letting you blab any secrets to Mr. Blunt here, a very clever gentleman, Mr. Blunt, with his fancy advertisements. But as it happens, I keep an eye on the advertisement columns. That's how I got wise to his little game." "You interest me exceedingly," said Tommy. "Won't you go on?" "Cheek won't help you, Mr. Blunt. From now on, you're a marked man. Give up this investigation and we'll leave you alone. Otherwise, God help you. Death comes swiftly to those who thwart our plans." Tommy did not reply. He was staring over the intruder's shoulder as though he saw a ghost. As a matter of fact, he was seeing something that caused him far more apprehension than any ghost could have done. Up to now, he had not given a thought to Albert as a factor in the game. He had taken for granted that Albert had already been dealt with by the mysterious stranger. If he had thought of him at all, it was as one lying stunned on the carpet in the outer office. He now saw that Albert had miraculously escaped the stranger's attention. But instead of rushing out to fetch a policeman in good, sound British fashion, Albert had elected to play a lone hand. The door behind the stranger had opened noiselessly, and Albert stood in the aperture, enveloped in a coil of rope. An agonized yelp of protest burst from Tommy, but too late. Fired with enthusiasm, Albert flung a loop of rope over the intruder's head and jerked him backwards off his feet. The inevitable happened. The pistol went off with a roar, and Tommy felt the bullet scorch his ear in passing as it buried itself in the plaster behind him. "I've got him, sir," cried Albert, flushed with triumph. "I've lassoed him. I've been practicing with a lasso in my spare time, sir. Can you give me a hand? He's very violent." Tommy hastened to his faithful henchman's assistance, mentally determining that Albert should have no further spare time. "You damned idiot," he said. "Why didn't you go for a policeman? Owing to this fool's play of yours? He as near as anything plugged me through the head. I've never had such a near escape." "Lassoed him in the nick of time, I did," said Albert, his ardor quite undamped. "It's wonderful what those chaps can do on the prairies, sir." "Quite so," said Tommy, "but we're not on the prairies. We happen to be in a highly civilized city. And now, my dear sir," he added to his prostrate foe, "what are we going to do with you?" A stream of oaths in a foreign language was his only reply. "Hush," said Tommy. "I don't understand a word of what you're saying, but I've got a shrewd idea it's not the kind of language to use before a lady. You'll excuse him, won't you, miss? Do you know, in the excitement of this little upset, I've quite forgotten your name?" "March," said the girl. She was still white and shaken, but she came forward now and stood by Tommy, looking down on the recumbent figure of the discomfited stranger. "What are you going to do with him?" "I could fetch a bobby now," said Albert helpfully. But Tommy, looking up, caught a very faint negative movement of the girl's head and took his cue accordingly. "We'll let him off this time," he remarked. "Nevertheless, I shall give myself the pleasure of kicking him downstairs if it's only to teach him manners to a lady." He removed the rope, hauled the victim to his feet, and propelled him briskly through the outer office. A series of shrill yelps was heard and then a thud. Tommy came back flushed but smiling. The girl was staring at him with round eyes. "Did you hurt him?" "I hope so," said Tommy. "But these foreigners make a practice of crying out before they're hurt, so I can't be quite sure about it." "Shall we come back into my office, Miss March, and resume our interrupted conversation?" "I don't think we shall be interrupted again. I'll have my lasso ready." "Sir, in case," said the helpful Albert. "Put it away," ordered Tommy sternly. He followed the girl into the inner office and sat down at his desk while she took a chair facing him. "I don't quite know where to begin," said the girl. "As you heard that man say, I was a passenger on the Nomadic." "The lady you advertised about, Miss O'Hara, was also on board." "Exactly," said Tommy. "That we know already. But I suspect you must know something about her doings on board that boat, or else that picturesque gentleman would not have been in such a hurry to intervene. I will tell you everything. The American ambassador was on board. One day, as I was passing his cabin, I saw this woman inside, and she was doing something so extraordinary that I stopped to watch. She had a man's boot in her hand." "A boot!" cried Tommy excitedly. "I'm sorry, Miss March, go on." "With a little pair of scissors, she was slitting up the lining. Then she seemed to push something inside. Just at that minute, the doctor and another man came down the passage, and immediately she dropped back on the couch and groaned. I waited, and I gathered from what was being said that she had pretended to feel faint. I said pretended because when I first caught sight of her, she was obviously feeling nothing of the kind." Tommy nodded. "Well, I rather hate to tell you the next part. I was curious, and also I'd been reading silly books, and I wondered if she'd put a bomb or a poison needle or something like that in Mr. Wilmot's boot. I know it's absurd, but I did think so. Anyway, next time I passed the empty cabin, I slipped in and examined the boot. I drew out from the lining a slip of paper. Just as I had it in my hand, I heard the steward coming and I hurried out so as not to be caught. The folded paper was still in my hand when I got into my own cabin. I examined it, Mr. Blunt. It was nothing but some verses from the Bible." "Verses from the Bible," said Tommy, very much intrigued. "At least I thought so at the time. I couldn't understand it, but I thought perhaps it was the work of a religious maniac. Anyway, I didn't feel it was worthwhile replacing it. I kept it without thinking much about it until yesterday when I used it to make into a boat for my little nephew to sail in his bath. As the paper got wet, I saw a queer kind of design coming out all over it. I hastily took it out of the bath and smoothed it out flat. The water had brought out the hidden message. It was a kind of tracing and looked like the mouth of a harbor. Immediately after that, I read your advertisement." Tommy sprang from his chair. "But this is most important. I see it all now. That tracing is probably the plan of some important harbor defenses. It had been stolen by this woman. She feared someone was on her track and, not daring to conceal it amongst her own belongings, she contrived this hiding place. Later, she obtained possession of the bag in which the boot was packed, only to discover that the paper had vanished. Tell me, Miss March, you have brought this paper with you?" The girl shook her head. "It's at my place of business." I run a beauty parlor in Bond Street. I am really an agent for the cyclone preparations in New York. That is why I had been over there. I thought the paper might be important, so I locked it up in the safe before coming out. Ought not Scotland Yard to know about it? Yes, indeed. Then shall we go there now, get it out, and take it straight to Scotland Yard? I am very busy this afternoon, said Tommy, adopting his professional manner and consulting his watch. The Bishop of London wants me to take up a case for him, a very curious problem concerning some vestments and 2 curates. Then in that case, said Miss March, rising, I will go alone. Tommy raised a hand in protest. As I was about to say, he said, the bishop must wait. I will leave a few words with Albert. I am convinced, Miss March, that until that paper has been safely deposited with Scotland Yard, you are in active danger. Do you think so? Said the girl doubtfully. I don't think, I'm sure. Excuse me. He scribbled some words on the pad in front of him, then tore off the leaf and folded it. Taking his hat and stick, he intimated to the girl that he was ready to accompany her. In the outer office, he handed the folded paper to Albert with an air of importance. I am called out on an urgent case. Explain that to his good lordship. If he comes, here are my notes on the case for Miss Robinson. Very good, sir, said Albert, playing up. And what about the Duchess's pearls? Tommy waved his hand irritably. That must wait also. He and Miss March hurried out. Halfway down the stairs, they encountered Tuppence coming up. Tommy passed her with a brusque, late again, Miss Robinson. I am called out on an important case. Tuppence stood still on the stairs and stared after them. Then, with raised eyebrows, she went on up to the office. As they reached the street, a taxi came sailing up to them. Tommy, on the point of hailing it, changed his mind. Are you a good walker, Miss March? He asked seriously. Yes. Why? Hadn't we better take that taxi? It will be quicker. Perhaps you did not notice the taxi driver has just refused to fare a little lower down the street. He was waiting for us. Your enemies are on the lookout. If you feel equal to it, it would be better for us to walk to Bond Street. In the crowded streets, they will not be able to attempt much against us. Very well, said the girl, rather doubtfully. They walked westwards. The streets, as Tommy had said, were crowded, and progress was slow. Tommy kept a sharp lookout. Occasionally, he drew the girl to one side with a quick gesture, though she herself had seen nothing suspicious. Suddenly, glancing at her, he was seized with compunction. I say, you look awfully done up. The shock of that man. Come into this place and have a good cup of strong coffee. I suppose you wouldn't hear of a nip of brandy? The girl shook her head with a faint smile. Coffee be it then, said Tommy. I think we can safely risk its being poisoned. They lingered some time over their coffee and finally set off at a brisker pace. We've thrown them off, I think, said Tommy, looking over his shoulder. Cyclone Lended was a small establishment in Bond Street with pale pink taffeta curtains, and 1 or 2 jars of face cream and a cake of soap decorating the window. Cicely March entered, and Tommy followed. The place inside was tiny. On the left was a glass counter with toilet preparations. Behind this counter was a middle-aged woman with gray hair and an exquisite complexion, who acknowledged Cicely March's entrance with a faint inclination of the head before continuing to talk to the customer she was serving. This customer was a small, dark woman. Her back was to them, and they could not see her face. She was speaking in slow, difficult English. On the right was a sofa and a couple of chairs with some magazines on a table. Here sat 2 men, apparently bored husbands waiting for their wives. Cicely March passed straight on through a door at the end, which she held ajar for Tommy to follow her. As he did so, the woman customer exclaimed, "Ah, but I think that is an amigo of mine," and rushed after them, inserting her foot in the door just in time to prevent its closing. At the same time, the 2 men rose to their feet. One followed her through the door, the other advanced to the shop attendant and clapped his hand over her mouth to drown the scream rising to her lips. In the meantime, things were happening rather quickly beyond the swing door. As Tommy passed through, a cloak was flung over his head, and a sickly odor assailed his nostrils. Almost as soon, however, it was jerked off again, and a woman's scream rang out. Tommy blinked a little and coughed as he took in the scene in front of him. On his right was the mysterious stranger of a few hours ago, and busily fitting handcuffs upon him was one of the bored men from the shop parlor. Just in front of him was Cicely March, wrestling vainly to free herself, whilst the woman customer from the shop held her firmly. As the latter turned her head and the veil she wore unfastened itself and fell off, the well-known features of Tuppence were revealed. "Well done, Tuppence," said Tommy, moving forward. "Let me give you a hand." "I shouldn't struggle if I were you, Miss O'Hara, or do you prefer to be called Miss March?" "This is Inspector Grace." Tommy said, "Tuppence, as soon as I read the note you left, I rang up Scotland Yard, and Inspector Grace and another man met me outside here." "Very glad to get hold of this gentleman," said the inspector, indicating his prisoner. "Hune's wanted badly, but we've never had cause to suspect this place, thought it was a genuine beauty shop." "You see," explained Tommy gently, "we do have to be so very careful. Why should anyone want the ambassador's bag for an hour or so? I put the question the other way round, supposing it was the other bag that was the important one? Someone wanted that bag to be in the ambassador's possession for an hour or so. Much more illuminating. Diplomatic luggage is not subjected to the indignities of a customs examination. Clearly smuggling, but smuggling of what? Nothing too bulky. At once, I thought of drugs. Then that picturesque comedy was enacted in my office. They'd seen my advertisement and wanted to put me off the scent or, failing that, out of the way altogether. But I happened to notice an expression of blank dismay in the charming lady's eyes when Albert did his lasso act. That didn't fit in very well with her supposed part. The stranger's attack was meant to assure my confidence in her. I played the part of the credulous sleuth with all my might, swallowed her rather impossible story, and permitted her to lure me here, carefully leaving behind full instructions for dealing with the situation. Under various pretexts, I delayed our arrival so as to give you all plenty of time. Cicely March was looking at him with a stony expression. You are mad. What do you expect to find here? Remembering that Richard saw a tin of bath salts. What do you say about beginning with the bath salts? Said the inspector. A very sound idea, sir. He picked up one of the dainty pink tins and emptied it on the table. The girl laughed. Genuine crystals, eh? Said Tommy. Nothing more deadly than carbonate of soda. Try the safe, suggested Tuppence. There was a small safe in the corner. The key was in the lock. Tommy swung it open and gave a shout of satisfaction. The back of the safe opened out into a big recess in the wall, and that recess was stacked with the same elegant tins of bath salts, rows and rows of them. He took one out and pried up the lid. The top showed the same pink crystals, but underneath was a fine white powder. The inspector uttered an exclamation. You've got it, sir. 10-to-1 that tin's full of pure cocaine. We knew there was a distributing area somewhere around here, handy to the West End, but we haven't been able to get a clue to it. This is a fine coup of yours, sir, rather a triumph for Blunt's brilliant detectives, said Tommy to Tuppence as they emerged into the street together. It's a great thing to be a married man. Your persistent schooling has at last taught me to recognize peroxide when I see it. Golden hair has got to be the genuine article to take me in. We will concoct a businesslike letter to the ambassador informing him that the matter has been dealt with satisfactorily. And now, my dear fellow, what about tea and lots of hot buttered muffins?